Welcome to the Teaching International podcast. This is Dr. Margaret Signorella from Penn State Brandywine. Today, I am talking with Dr. Mildred Mickle from Penn State Greater Allegheny. I'm talking with Dr. Mickle today about her new book, and as a way of background, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you got interested in poetry.
That is a tough question because growing up, I just wrote poetry. I guess I'd have to go back to how I got interested in literature, if that's okay.
Sure.
So as a child, and I guess this is normal, if anything is normal, but as a child, I was scared of the dark. And so I would pester my daddy to, stay up with me, or, I'd go invade my parents' bedroom and all this. And of course, my dad didn't care one way or another, but my mom was like, okay, she's got to learn how to sleep in her own bed and go to bed at night and all this other kind of stuff. And so, long story shorter, my daddy finally just suggested that I read at night. This gave me an excuse to keep the lights on. And so I'd find myself reading and just getting really hooked on just loving stories and loving literature. And I would read until I fell asleep. I'd wake up, the lights would still be on, and I'd turn them off and go back to sleep. So that started the love of literature. I can't really remember when I started writing poetry. I just wrote. I read and wrote. My parents, when I would give them poems, and heaven only knows where those poems are now, lost, thrown away, whatever, would be, just appreciative, and, it was really cute. So they encouraged me to read and to write and appreciated what I did. So I think that's half the battle, is having parental support, having family support. I think I also like writing poetry because in a way I'm kind of lazy. And so I say that with a giggle because poetry is short. It's shorter than a short story. It's definitely shorter than, a novel. And I love reading novels. I love reading short stories, but I really love producing poetry because it's manageable to me. And for some reason, it just makes sense. It makes more sense to me. It's not to say that I can't write a novel or, anything else, because, I just edited a book and I've written things and published them. So that's not the issue. But in terms of expediency, in terms of like actually sitting down and producing a substantive draft of something, poetry just works for some reason. So that's a long drawn out answer to how I got started.
The reason why I asked you is that I think that some people understand poetry and understand the urge to write poetry, and other people are baffled by it. And I have to put myself in the latter category because I have never really felt the urge to try to write a poem, and I don't think I'm alone. But I also know that some of our colleagues have indeed started writing poetry when they never even considered doing it for many years. You started early, but you would also agree, wouldn't you, that it's not impossible to start later?
No, indeed. Well, and again, that's the beauty of poetry. It's why I love writing it. It's why I love teaching it. It's why I love reading it. It's a different kind of experience, I will admit. And there are a variety of poetic styles. You don't have to rhyme. You don't have to, use meter. There's free verse. There's narrative poems. But the thing I really like about poetry is that it is flexible. And what I mean by that is that not only is it an oral medium, for hearing, but it's also a visual medium for seeing. So, and I'm not saying that stories aren't that, novels aren't that, it just takes a little longer. I think that it would be a lot easier to try and write poetry later in life than it would be to do other things, because again, it's short, it's flexible. Now, having said that, the shorter verse styles like haiku, they're deceptively simple. And so the thing to remember with writing poetry too is that even if you start off with a large draft, you're still going to have to edit down, because poetry, its function, to my mind, is that you're condensing your words. You want to prune out a lot of extraneous descriptive language and get to the nouns and the verbs. I mean, you want some adjectives in there and things like that, but you really want to get down to the minimal amount of words you need to convey, what it is that you're trying to convey. And poetry functions to capture a few minutes, a few seconds even. Depending on the verse style, it can do that. Of course, it can be really long too. We have epic poems to that effect. So it just depends on what you want to do. But it is, to my mind, a lot more accessible in that regard.
Let's talk about the book that you just worked on.
Okay.
And let's also set the stage for the book. Could you talk a little bit about what you particularly like about Maya Angelou's work?
Oh boy. Well, what is there not to like? So I'll say that, and that's that will probably be my standard response that I'll return to. But I like the fact that her work is accessible. When you think about the subject matter that she writes about, that is not accessible, but she makes it accessible through her prose and her poetry. She talks about taboo topics, and of course her most well-known work is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, where she talks about growing up as a Black female in the South, in the segregated Jim Crow South, and struggling through having been the victim of child molestation. So the things that saved her, though, were the community, the Black community that supported her family and her, and the influence of teachers. It was a community effort. She's raised in an environment that is supportive. She's well educated. When she was dealing with a trauma or post-trauma, I guess post-traumatic stress disorder, you'd be able to answer that better than I would, but at any rate, what saved her was reading literature. And in particular, reading the literature produced by the Harlem Renaissance writers, but not exclusively them. She fell in love with Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetry, and he's a little bit before the Harlem Renaissance, but still definitely an influence in American letters and in African American letters. So her autobiographies chronicle, this process of growing up, being Black, female, and realizing that even though she's well-educated, articulate, she does not have that many career opportunities available to her. She graduates from high school and then is about trying to figure out what to do with her life. She moves to California, San Francisco, and tries to make her way there. She starts to explore her sexuality, has a one-night stand that results in a pregnancy. And again, it's the support of her family. Her mother, asked her, "Do you love this boy who has, essentially, gotten you pregnant?" And she said, "No." So she's like, "I don't see the need to ruin two lives." So she's not forced into, a shotgun wedding. She has the child out of wedlock. Her mother tries to help her as much as she can to raise the child. But then it's about trying to figure out how to survive. And so she chronicles how she goes to, I don't want to say the cliche dark space, but it's not necessarily a dark space. It's a not good place. So for a while, she is trying to figure out, how is she going to support herself and her child? She tries the domestic thing, not for long. She does other kind of menial domestic kinds of things. They don't work out. At one point, she's the madam of a brothel, and most likely she probably was a prostitute, but that kind of gets glossed over. And so she's really struggling with this, particularly because of how she was raised. She knows that her grandmother would not approve if her grandmother knew about these kinds of things. The interesting thing that helps her, again, is literature. She says, and I can't remember right now in which autobiography, it's probably the second one, which eludes me right now, but anyways, she says that one of the things that helped her was reading Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And so she, sort of the irony of, engaging in, what people would consider to be criminal behavior, but the true crime is the fact that, with all of her education, this is what she's reduced to doing. It pays the most money so that she can support her child. I like how she uses literature to make, again, these taboo topics a little bit more accessible, and to help people to realize that certain kinds of behavior, it's not as clear cut. It's not in our best interest to judge people without understanding the context behind the behavior, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So she chronicles again in her autobiographies how she did a lot of things that, well, a lot of people wouldn't do just one of these things in a lifetime. She was dating a man at one point who was addicted to heroin. And so she was toying with trying it just to see, I guess looking for some kind of escape. And so this man basically saved her life by showing her what it means to be addicted. So he showed her the ugly side. He shot up, and she had to witness the change in his behavior. And so after it was over, or maybe while it was going on, he's like, "Are you sure you still want to do this?" And so she had the opportunity to make choices, to understand that, yes, there are consequences for your actions, but to see for herself and to make those choices, in a time and in a place where a lot of Black women really didn't have that many choices. In the 1950s, and of course, this is all in my introduction and stuff, so, y'all can fill in the blanks when you read it, but in the 1950s, she engaged in an interracial marriage. She married a Greek man, Maya Angelou, and she decided, after they got divorced, to keep his name, which I think is interesting too, but that's a whole other story. At any rate, they got married in one of the few states that didn't have a law against interracial marriages. I think it's very interesting that she was engaging in this. She said that they didn't get married. It wasn't really to make a political statement. But here again is, one of the tricky things about, being Black in America. You do things because you're doing things, and the other societal forces can jump in and say, well, this is a political statement, when you're just trying to live your life. She met Tosh and they got along, and he did not have a problem with the fact that she's single and trying to raise a son, and he welcomed becoming this kid's father and trying to make a family, make a life together. So those were the things that were important to them. Yes, they had to deal with the looks in the public censure, even though they got married in a state that didn't have this law against interracial marriages. But again, it's still a novelty. They were still considered to be a novelty. And they did get some nasty looks. And so she talks about this in her autobiography, where she was getting looks from both sides, from both cultures. So white folks on the street, Black folks in the community. That was difficult terrain to navigate too. So when you read her works, you realize that, again, she's telling her story and she's controlling her narrative. And she's demonstrating that Blackness is not monolithic. Not one formula for any one person of any particular demographic applies here. So when they got divorced, she didn't like it. Well, and he didn't either, her husband, but they tried to make it work and it just didn't. And so she found other things to do. She decided to try and dance. So she took dance lessons and became a calypso dancer. She joined the Harlem Writers Guild and was encouraged to start writing. I'm telling these things out of chronological order, but at any rate, she got a signal role in Porgy and Bess, and that gave her the opportunity to travel around the world and again to gain perspective. And so I think I return to the fact again that it was literature that helped save her. If she hadn't read the diverse kinds of things that she read as a child and probably continued reading as an adult, it would not have given her the perspective, think critically, to be flexible, to try different things, to be open to possibilities. And so I think if I had to say the thing that I admire the most about her is that, yeah, she was flexible, and that love of literature really helped to sustain her and to give her the kind of perspective to help her grow and continue to grow. So that's my long drawn answer to that question.
No, that's good. I certainly heard more recently this particular poem, And Still I Rise. It seems like that poem really speaks to a lot of issues that we're facing right now.
Yeah, it does apply. I think that, again, to think about how she grew up, with the deck stacked against her. Sorry for the cliche, but that's basically the way it was. If you're Black and you're female and you're, in the Jim Crow segregated South, you don't have that many opportunities available to you. The career paths for Black women, for Black folks in particular, in the Jim Crow South, were you could teach, you could be a nurse, you could preach, or you could just get married and be a domestic. And so even those opportunities were fraught with problems. If you're a domestic, you're subject to being exploited by people you work for. And it doesn't matter, if you can sing an operatic aria. The expectation is for you to clean the house and cook the food. If you're a teacher, again, you're kind of limited by the politics of, where you're teaching at. There's a set curriculum that you have to teach. And one of the interesting things, too, if I recall correctly back in the day, and this is based on discussions that I've had with my mom and, of course, studying African-American literature, it was frowned on to teach some kinds of Black literature. It was definitely frowned on to look at slavery and to study it because there's such a stigma applied to it. So if you were going to teach literature, you taught dead white males, basically, the classics. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm not saying that having an appreciation for that is wrong. But if you exclude a lot of the other kinds of literature and the history, then it can be a little problematic. So there is that. And having said that, it's not that it wasn't taught, but it wasn't as validated, I suppose, as the standard stuff.
It wouldn't have been a regular part of the curriculum in high school, for example, until I don't know when high schools would have expanded their offerings. But an example would be, and I thought of this example because you read a poem by Langston Hughes at the World Water Day celebration on campus. And I've always, even though I have never read much poetry and do not understand it very well, I've always, for some reason, been drawn to the poetry of Langston Hughes. And, for example, What Happens to a Dream Deferred.
Yeah, Harlem. Yeah, it's a powerful poem. Well, and the power of it, again, and this is what I love about poetry, is that it looks at situations that are controversial, taboo, difficult to access, and couches it in other kinds of language. So in that poem by Langston Hughes that's titled Harlem, he equates the dream deferred to being, a sticky sweet mess or rotten meat. These are common things that people encounter. And so it helps to make that frustration and despair and anger and disgust more accessible to an audience. So yeah, he was definitely a powerful writer and definitely an influence on, generations of Black artists and scholars. And so, yeah, I love Langston Hughes too.
I had never heard the poem that you read.
The Negro Speaks of Rivers. That poem was the poem that pretty much put him on the map. This became sort of the signature poem of the Harlem Renaissance. And the power of the poem, again, is in finding common ties, the things that link us as humans. And so he says, I've known rivers, deep, ancient, dusky rivers. And so he equates rivers, with the flow of blood in human veins. And he mentions particular rivers, the Nile, the Euphrates, all of these. These are the rivers that tie humanity together. These are the rivers where humans, like civilizations, developed. The common tie amongst all of us is our need for water, clean, potable water. And even in our bodies, we wouldn't have much substance if we didn't have water. Now, I'm not a scientist, but our bodies are made up, 70% water, maybe? I don't
I actually don't recall the percentage, but
know.
it's
It's a
fine.
lot. It's a lot.
It's a lot, yes.
So his poem is sad and uplifting. And one of the things that I didn't get into with my introduction to The Negro Speaks of Rivers is the fact that it's written in spiritual mode. So I was talking about the spirituals, and that's why I chose the two poems that I did for World Water Day. Wade in the Water, which is a spiritual song and a poem, and The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So the spiritual aspect of it, and I'm talking about spirituals, the art form, the music form, but spiritual as in, spirituality. The spiritual aspect of The Negro Speaks of Rivers is that it's sad, it's slow, it's mournful, but it's also hopeful. It's expressing sadness and frustration at the fact that for whatever reasons, humanity tends to forget our common ties, and that is the need for clean, potable water. We would not be able to survive without it. At the heart of every human being, just about every being on the planet, is the need for water. So when it comes down to it, these notions of superiority, whatever race you are, whatever status you claim to be, if you're an aristocrat, if you're a commoner, the common denominator amongst humans is water and our need for it. So it's a powerful poem in that regard, and it is definitely a reminder, it's a critique of these notions of superiority because, well, as we know in America, there's been this ongoing debate, and I still don't understand why it's a debate over superiority, white superiority, male superiority, whatever it is, superiority, put something in front of it or behind it or around it. It doesn't make any sense. It's not logical, but we still hash out these issues. And of course, even thinking now in 2017 with a lot of the nonsense that's going on, it's disheartening to think that, that still goes on. So I was subtly hitting at, the climate change, issues as well with that poem, but more so about the spiritual and spirituality issues. Mm-hmm. So that ties into Maya Angelou, interestingly enough, because her works do the same thing on a different level and different ways.
Could you give a couple examples from her work?
One of the chapters in that book is called Spirituals and Blues Enclosed, a comparative analysis of Black folk forms in the poetry of Maya Angelou, Sterling Brown, and Langston Hughes. This chapter it was a labor of love, and it wound up being longer than I planned for it to be. But the gist of it is, I define, what spirituals and blues are, and I look at how Langston Hughes and Sterling Brown do their thing and how that influences Angelou. She mentions growing up that one of the other things that helped to save her was going to church if she had a choice. In the Black community in the South, church is big, and there's a reason for that. So I mentioned this when I gave a brief definition of the spirituals at World Water Day. And so I mentioned how enslaved folks during the antebellum period were most likely required to go to church on Sundays. So they had their little section, and then slave owners had their section because things were segregated. The point was, to engage in indoctrination. Unfortunately, Christianity was used to justify slavery. Things in particular from the book of Timothy, where there's this story basically that you're supposed to serve, for whatever crimes or whatever. I'm paraphrasing very badly, but people who are biblical scholars and folks who read the Bible can read the book of Timothy and see. You get your indoctrination in church, be happy where you're at, you'll be better off in the afterlife, whatever. This is the penance you're serving. And then, of course, you can see how that would not be sustaining. So folks in the community, the slave community, decided to hold their own church services. And so late at night, when folks were asleep, they would slip away into the woods and have their own church services. And those services would manifest in a variety of ways. People could get up and testify, they could feel the Spirit calling them. It's a release. An important part of those church services was singing. And so if you had a member of the group who had a very good memory and who perhaps was literate, although becoming literate was a risk. If you were caught engaging in reading and writing and teaching other people to read and write, the consequences were awful, resulting in torture and or being sold away, maybe even being killed. Okay, so if you had a member of the group who had a very good memory or who was literate, that person would stand up in front of the congregation, the group, and call out the lines, and the congregation would respond. So this gave folks an opportunity to express their frustrations at the plight that they were in, and it gave them the opportunity to come together in the act of creating something that's beautiful out of, a situation that really wasn't. I think, again, that applies to Angelou and her works, poetry and prose. We see this dynamic again and again. Her works are written to call out to people and to engender a response. Her works deal with very sad topics, but they are hopeful as well. I think her strategy too, and plenty of scholars have written about this stuff, but was brilliant because she waited until she was middle-aged in her 40s to start writing these stories. Her son was grown, so she didn't have to worry about, that dynamic. The people that she grew up with in her community were either dead or old or, didn't matter at this point. And it's not that she was about revealing scandalous information about members of the community. It was about her telling her story and controlling her narrative. And so at the point when she wrote, she didn't have as much to lose. Of course, the times too were different. We didn't have invasive technology, people with video cameras on their phones just waiting to capture someone in an indiscretion. So, yeah, it was a different time. But, yeah, her works are spiritual in that regard, in the sense of calling out to people and eliciting a response. And so if you think about that dynamic in her poetry and prose, it does make sense.
So if you were going to recommend a couple of her poems to someone who wanted an introduction to her work, do you have a couple of suggestions?
I like the collection I Shall Not Be Moved, which came out in 1990. And the reason why is because of the title. It is based on an African-American spiritual called I Shall Not Be Moved. That poem, the title poem of this collection, deals with the treatment of Black women from slavery up through and beyond, and how they've taken control of defining who they are in a society that would try to define them. But there are just a lot of gems in that collection. The first poem, Worker's Song, is fascinating. She is encoding blues, and she's also encoding a few other things too, and I actually write about that in one of my chapters in this book. There's just some beautiful poetry in that collection. I mean, well, I'm biased. I like all of her stuff, but if I had to recommend a book of her poems, I'd say start with that one.
So the book that we're talking about that you just wrote, you've written other books in the same series, correct?
Yes. I did Gwendolyn Brooks and hello, kitty. I did I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Mm-hmm. So the Gwendolyn Brooks one was a compilation of essays that had been published before, so we got permission to reprint them. And the point was to make this, an accessible collection, someone who wanted to get like a quick view of some of the major scholarship on Gwendolyn Brooks, mm-hmm. just to learn about her. And so it was tough narrowing down the choice, but we did. And then the I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, again, because it's Maya Angelou's most popular work. It's probably, her best known work, right. Even though she published a lot in her lifetime. The thinking was to just, again, compile a book that's easily accessible of some of the, major scholarship on that particular work, so that it's right there. You pick it up and look through it. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's suggested stuff. And if you look at the bibliographies for the individual chapters, you can find out about more. That was, again, a labor of love, putting that collection together. The thing I found for this collection, just on Maya Angelou, I had to caution people when we started this project. I don't want essays on I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, because there's already a book out there for that. Let's kind of widen the field and explore some of the other things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I hadn't made that stipulation clear from the start, I would have gotten a lot more I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. There is actually an essay in there that deals with I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. So I let one in, but I really wanted to be more expansive and to be equal opportunity. So the way that we structured the book was to have half of it be on her prose, so the autobiographies and other kinds of prose things that she did, and then the other half to be about the poetry. And so I was pleased with that. I know, unfortunately, and at least one of the essays does talk about this, for whatever reasons, some scholars tend to view Maya Angelou's poetry as being lesser than. It's not as rigorous as some other poetry that's been published. I disagree. I think that just because her poems are written in simple language or that she uses folk forms doesn't lessen it at all. In fact, it makes it much more interesting and complex. There's this tendency, and okay, this is my bias. It's a bias that I struggle with in the field of English literature, in the academy. I think it's poor writing to just kind of list a whole bunch of jargony terms and not define them. I think that if there's just this focus on literary theory at the exclusion of the primary text, that does the primary text a disservice. Why are you talking about it at all? And I'm not saying that theory is bad. I think it serves a purpose. I think it's interesting. I'm working on my own theories, but I don't believe in trying to apply a theory to a text where it doesn't apply. It's like putting a square in a circular slot, and it doesn't work as well. So for a while now, I think that there's been this stigma against, more scholarly engagement of her poetry. And I've not been able to understand it. For a while, I must confess, I kind of jumped on the bandwagon and said, oh, well, I don't know about this. But the more I think about her poems, the more that I read them, the more I begin to appreciate the critiques, the subtle critiques that are encoded in the simplicity of her language and in the types of things that she talks about. There's a poem, I'll remember the title tomorrow, but it's in one of her earlier collections where she's talking about kids playing a game. That poem is subtly brilliant because she's alluding to how games serve multiple purposes in African American culture. I suspect in other cultures. But in African American culture, there's this game called the Dozens. So I don't know if you're familiar with it, but for folks who aren't, one of the standard forms of it is the yo mama jokes, right? So making fun of someone's mom. This would seem to be disrespectful. Well, in a way it is, right? But there's a lesson to be learned in playing the game. The goal of the game is to insult your opponent in some way, shape, or form, their family, them, themselves. And the person who starts fighting first loses. This teaches a survival skill. How do you contain your temper? How do you manage difficult situations and keep a cool head? Because if in the Jim Crow segregated South, a white person insults you and you lose your temper and start fighting, that's a death sentence. You're going to be lynched. So it taught survival skills. And she has encoded that message in this poem about playing games. If you just read the poem on the surface, you'd be like, okay, that's cute, next. And I imagine that could be a response. Or maybe it would engender some nostalgia. Yeah, I remember playing hopscotch and doing these kinds of things. But she's alluding to this history of using whatever you have at hand to teach survival skills.
If I understand correctly, you're saying that some critics, you believe, have undervalued her poetry because, in your opinion, they view it as not as complex as her other works, and you think that's maybe not a correct judgment.
Yes, I definitely do. I think that, one of the things that I really want people to come away with from reading this book is to pay attention, to be more open to what she's trying to do in her works. And I'm not saying that the more cerebral kind of poetry that we get from some of our more celebrated Black poets, both in the past and in contemporary times, is not important. I'm just saying that Angelou is doing something different, and it is important too. So, as soon as this interview comes out, there are going to be people chiming up, I think Angelou's poetry is rigorous and this and that. And I welcome that. Wonderful. Help spread the word. So I can see both sides of this, and I'd love to have conversations with people about what is rigorous and what isn't, and what's going on with poetry, because again, that's fun. So that is the beauty of literature, again, is that it can inspire these kinds of discussions and debates, and before you know it, the text has tricked you into learning something that you hadn't anticipated. And I think that is valuable. We tend to read for a variety of reasons, whether it's to be informed, whether it's to be entertained, for whatever reasons, and that's lovely. Keep reading. But I also think too that a lot of times we don't trust our instincts when we read. And this is something that I try to teach my students in my literature classes, is if you don't like something, well, then explore why. If you like something, explore why. Writers write, artists produce things because they want people to react to their works. Now, they would prefer it if people like what they do. But even if they don't, that's a reaction. And explore that. See what you can discover. If you're not as invested, well, that's something to explore too. But having those reactions is important. And trusting your instincts.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. I think it would be good if you gave the title of your book and all that important detail.
Well, the title of the latest book that I did is called Maya Angelou, Critical Insights. I edited this book and I also contributed some of the chapters. But this just came out in 2016, and it's published by Salem Press, which is a division of EBSCO Information Services, Inc. And all of this, of course, is on the title page. It was a labor of love, and I'm very happy to have been a part of this project, because I think that the more you read of Angelou's works, just the more fascinating and amazing it is. In the 86 years that she was on this planet, she achieved so many things. Just even one of the things that she managed to do would be amazing. And the fact that she did so many things and earned so many accolades in a variety of fields is just awe-inspiring.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Teaching International podcast.